Hello and welcome back for the last Questions Fair session of the day. My name is Heske and I'm reporting to you live from the Lighthouse. We're about to get started on our sixth speaker of this plenary session, of this plenary day. It's Sanjay Reddy and he's with us in the Inequalities constellation. It's incredible to see how much activity there's been throughout the galaxy today. Thank you so much for bringing up all the questions on your mind and helping us tease them out and thinking about which questions are going into that final list of 100. Now, if this is one of the first sessions you're tuning in for, remember that you can actually participate in real time directly in the session. Here's a little video to explain to you how that works. First, go to ysiplenary.org and click the night sky. This is the Questions Fair, where each star is a question, and each group of stars, or constellation, contains questions within a particular topic. You can find Questions Fair sessions in the schedule in the left sidebar and join them from there. Just enter the session and join the Zoom. As you listen to the speaker motivate their questions, think about which questions you believe to be pertinent for YSI. While the speaker talks, suggest your questions to your peers by entering them into the panel. This is not a Q&A. The questions are suggestions for research in YSI, not a question for the speaker to answer. Take a look at all the questions that were suggested and like the ones that you think are best. The questions moderator will select the most liked questions and present them to the speaker for a comment. These questions will be added to the constellation, where they can be further refined. Refine the questions by finding the best exact phrasing. Suggest a rephrasing yourself, or like the rephrasings that you think are good. After the session is over, you can find the submitted questions in the constellations. As a plenary participant, you can mark your 10 favorite questions in the graph. Just click the star in the corner of the questions card and they will be added to your YSI profile. The most popular questions will make it into the final list. Great. So with that, I think it's ready. I think it's time to send you over to the constellation. Here we go to your questions moderator, Audra.
We hold these truths to be self-evident and see-through. Everyone's invited to the party and they're equal. Equal opportunity for all the party people, regardless of their party or their perspectival people. Yo, but here's the thing though, if we're being really real, we don't seem to all be playing on the same shaped playing field. Everybody's game involvement doesn't flow with the same feel. Everyone ain't dealt the same cards, don't just tell me that's the deal, tell me why. Please define this ideal concept called equality. Everyone is equal except that some are born with property. Everyone is equal but some can't afford to lobby the same government that's meant to hold us equal in our sovereignty. Inequality, inequality. Some got it awesome, some got poverty. Did we want its opposite at all? Or speaking honestly, is all this inequality the crux of our economy?
Welcome to our question session with Professor Sanjay Reddy. My name is Audra Aucoin and I will be your question moderator. In order to guide future research aimed at providing the right answers, we must first ask the right questions. The main task of this YSI plenary is to collaboratively formulate the most pertinent question to address future research. This also means the main task for both speakers and participants in the question session is not to answer the questions. Instead, the purpose is to contribute in finding and shaping research questions to guide future YSI projects. The first part of the session works as a collaborative question incubator. In the graph, you will see questions already submitted by Professor Reddy. While he is speaking, you are invited and encouraged to suggest new questions and like questions suggested by others. The questions with the most likes will be presented for commentary by our speaker. Then we will work on rephrasing the questions after his speech. After this session, our questions will have a chance to be one of the 100 favorite questions of the plenary. Without further ado, I hand it over to Florence Jacoud to introduce our friend and speaker, Professor Sanjay Reddy.
Thank you very much, Audra, for your presentation. I would like to give a very warm welcome to Sanjay Reddy, our speaker. He's an associate professor of economics at the New School for Social Research, and also he has a long-lasting trajectory in supporting several YSI activities. He has been an advisor for the Development Economics, South Asia, Africa, and Inequality working group. So thank you very much, Sanjay, for being here with us. We're very looking forward to your presentation. So without further ado, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Florencia. What a great pleasure and honor to be here, though I am quite sure I cannot compete against the hip-hop video which preceded me, so I won't even try to do that. I think it digested in a nutshell what the most important questions are. But as you say, Florencia, I've had a long association with YSI really from the beginning, and it's such a marvel and really gratifying to see how much it has grown, how many more topics there are, how many more people are involved, and in what ways it's really changing the discipline. But of course, there's a long way to go further. I don't want to talk for too long. I'd rather leave time for discussion. So let me just review the three questions that I put out, and in the process make some remarks about our approach to the theme of inequality within the discipline of economics and more generally in society. The first question, which I wanted to raise this afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you are, concerns how political contexts influence economics and why does that matter? And let me address this with reference to the subject of inequality. The theme of inequality has gone in and out of fashion in the study of economics. There have been periods where it has been very much at the forefront, and there are periods where it has been very much in the background, hardly mentioned at all, or even viewed as an unwelcome visitor to the discussion. Bad manners to mention it. I was a student during such a period, what one might refer to or think of in retrospect as the high neoliberal era in the 1980s and 1990s, I would say to a considerable degree, in which the focus was entirely on how to achieve growth, how to achieve Pareto improvements, and very little on inequality. And to the extent that inequality was discussed at all, it was discussed in a way that, in retrospect, we would see as rather limited and perhaps as having missed the real story. So, for example, in the 1990s, all the discussion about inequality, such as there was in the more prestigious sections of American and world economics, academia, and also policymaking, was about wage inequalities, inequalities between skilled and unskilled, so-called skilled and unskilled workers. And different hypotheses were put forward as to why there appeared to be growing inequalities between these different kinds of workers, for example, having to do with growing premia on education, which might be associated with skill-biased technological change due to information technology or other factors, and so on. But hardly any attention, if any attention, was paid in the mainstream and in the more prestigious centers of the discipline and policymaking to the question of inequality between labor and capital. But in retrospect, we see that this was really the big story, whether it's in terms of the rise of the share of the top 1% or the top 1% of 1%. It's the inequality between capital and labor incomes, which was by far the more powerful factor. And of course, that in turn was underpinned by changes in the policy environment, deregulation, globalization, financialization, and other factors which made that boom of profits and of capital incomes possible. And of course, in recent years, more and more scholars have come to study that. But that's an example of a blindness which was almost structural for about 20 years in mainstream economics, and which had to be overcome. And today we're in a very different era in which there's an enormous interest in the study of inequality for very good reasons, focusing much more on these big themes, which had been completely sidelined and viewed as unimportant or uninteresting. But this is just an instance of the rise and fall of interest in inequality in the discipline of economics over a much longer period. I recently came to know about the so-called Italian school, which was very interested in inequality, and in particular in the role of certain policy instruments such as taxation of wealth and of inheritance in the period between 1890 and the 1920s. And the role of this Italian school, which included people such as Gini and Pareto, but also others, in this debate, both for and against such policies, was quite significant. So much so that Hugh Dalton, for example, who gave us the Dalton Inequality Index, which was a direct predecessor to the famous Atkinson Inequality Index, cites the Italian school in his book on the subject in the 1920s quite extensively. But after that period of concern with the subject of inequality and such policy instruments, it was almost completely once again pushed out of view. I remember, to jump back to the 1990s, that when I was a graduate student, there was no mention of inheritance taxes or of wealth taxes, or hardly any mention in macroeconomics or in public finance classes, with the emphasis being very much on other kinds of taxation. The only reference I think I heard to inheritance taxes was a derisory one during my own economic studies, because of the premise that the bequest motive was a very important reason for people to save, without any serious empirical or theoretical discussion of that topic. So I think we have to be aware that whether it's inequality or whether it's other topics, the interest in such themes ebbs and flows because of broader societal factors. And this is one of the inescapable predicaments of the discipline of economics. We might like that we would be more like a natural science in the sense of having a certain degree of accumulation and a certain degree of independence from these societal concerns, but we are not. Much as there may be a scientific element in what it is that we do and that there ought to be, it is also the case that we are inextricably bound to societal forces and factors which influence what it is that is viewed as being important or unimportant at a moment in time. We can certainly contest the going fixations or trends, but at the same time, the discipline as a whole is caught within waves that are from such sources. Now, are the tools of economics to understand inequality adequate? Well, of course, these different questions are bound together. Many of the tools that we have emerged in a period where the study of inequality was, to a considerable extent, sidelined, as I mentioned, with a greater focus on efficiency and growth than on distribution. Of course, there were traditions within the discipline which always emphasized the relationship between these two, that they were inextricably linked. But at the same time, within the mainstream, there was the tendency not just to try to separate them, but to focus almost exclusively upon efficiency and growth, as if the issues could be separated. I was thinking about this issue this morning in terms of what many of you may be familiar with as Euler's law, which is the idea that in a constant returns to scale production technology, the payments to various factors of production, if they are paid their marginal product, will exactly exhaust the total output. But that's only true in the case of constant returns to scale. And in the case of decreasing returns to scale, you have a leftover, a surplus. Whereas in the case of increasing returns to scale, the total output does not suffice to make payments to the factors of production according to this logic. Now, if we look around the world and we ask the question, where are the sources of wealth today? It's a very interesting question to ask in these theoretical terms, because it seems to me we have sources of wealth which are of all three kinds. but in particular, which fall under the increasing returns to scale and the decreasing returns to scale heading. One example are the Silicon Valley plutocrats associated with increasing returns to scale network-based technologies, for example, Facebook or the like, Google. These are instances in which, in principle, according to the logic I just outlined, the output should not suffice to pay out to all of the factors of production which are involved, what they are due according to their marginal products. So how is it that these are actually sources of wealth for particular individuals? Well, one answer would be that the content creators, for instance, are not being paid. So they're being paid less than their marginal product, as opposed to being paid their marginal product. And that's one of the reasons that an enormous amount of wealth is available to be appropriated by those who possess these companies. On the other side, we have the giant rentier interests in places like Russia, for instance, and many others elsewhere in the world too, the mining companies and those who own them, the oil extraction industry and those who own it, and so forth. And these are cases, one could argue, of decreasing returns to scale technologies, where the rent derives from simply possessing or owning that particular resource, which is much more straightforward to understand. Now, there are countries in the world, China, for example, where manufacturing is also a major source of wealth. And it's a little bit more complicated to understand what is involved there. But I would argue that there are also elements of increasing returns to scale that are involved, and elements of the factors of production not being paid their true cost, in particular through environmental devastation, which is not being adequately costed. So that's an example of the tools of economics as we possess them being potentially available to be used to understand inequality in the world, the contemporary world. At the same time, it seems to me, we very quickly run out of steam when we try to understand every issue in these terms. Which brings me to my third question. What should be the relation between economics and other disciplines? I was also trained in social anthropology, and one of the things which is greatly emphasized in that discipline is the study of kinship and the family, which is something which economists by and large have ignored. And yet we are increasingly aware that family structures are very important to the production of and reproduction of inequalities. This has become something that has become more apparent through the interest in assortative mating, for example, the fact that people who have high incomes are more likely to form unions with other people who have high incomes. But of course, in the traditional world, it wasn't so much through individuals engaging in assortative mating, but through caste, class, race, and other forms of stratification in the kinds of mating which took place, which in turn, of course, led to property being concentrated and being transmitted over generations in particular ways due to features of the inheritance regime, the legal order, the customary order, which also existed. For instance, the institution of primogeniture, which led to property being concentrated in the eldest son, was hugely important, as many of us know who have read either the social science and historical literature or the plain old literature of Europe in the 19th century and previously. So these kinds of institutions, social norms, legal orders, and so forth, in conjunction with particular structures of feeling, as the British literary theorist Raymond Williams put it, help to produce and to reproduce inequalities. And we cannot understand how inequalities are not just generated, but cemented, maintained, and extended over time without paying attention to this range of social, cultural, and also political factors. To go back to the example of a surplus being divided, when it exists in a production facility or setting of some kind, that's also a question of power. How is it that the surplus is to be divided will depend on norms of various kinds. One of the models which I used in my PhD thesis involved generalized Nash bargaining many years ago, which involved a parameter which described the relative power of the different parties in capturing the available surplus. But one of the questions that I had in my mind then, and I still have in my mind, is that really an explanation or is this just a description? Because it seems to me that if one wants to have a deeper explanation as to why it is that certain people have the power or have the influence to capture, to grab a larger share of the surplus, one needs to go into the various other sociological, political, and cultural or anthropological insights which pertain to that. And this calls for something like a unification of the social sciences. Inequality is an example of a theme which simply cannot be understood without that type of boundary crossing and integration. These are 3 questions, but there are many more questions in the sky, as many as there are stars, as you see, and as Heske underlined in her introduction. So I look forward very much to hearing what yours are.
Thank you very much, Sanjay, for your insightful presentation and for your reflections. I particularly would like to highlight the point that you made in when you said that it is important to focus on which are the sources of wealth in order to tax them and to use them for policy, for a distributional policy. But I'm very curious about what our audience is thinking. So now I would like to move to the questions. So let's go to question number 1. And it says, how does the inequality between capital and labor explain the huge distributional inequalities between the 1% and the 99%?
Should I respond, Florencia, to that?
So it's necessarily for you to answer the questions. Rather, what we are interested in is in your reflections on whether the questions are important for or suitable for a research agenda, for instance, for a PhD project, a master thesis, and so on and so forth. So it's either we're interested in your reflections, the questions, and the suitability of the questions, rather than in answering them.
So let me just say that this is a hugely important question, as I already signaled, and there has been, in recent years, quite a bit of work on this issue. If you look at the work of Thomas Piketty and his collaborators, for example, this has been a major theme for good reason, which is that if one looks at the upper end, the highest end of the distribution and why it has pulled away from the rest, it becomes clear that the fact that capital owners have done as well as they have because of the policy environment and perhaps because of other aspects of the neoliberal era is crucial to explaining why it is that has happened. So I think it's an enormously important question in substantive terms. It would be a great topic for a master's thesis to review that literature. I think for a PhD thesis that seeks to make an original contribution, perhaps it would be interesting to go beyond that in some way, to start to ask questions about policy options and alternatives, for example, or to look at whether that has always been the case historically or whether it's been true in certain epochs more than it has been in others, and why?
Thank you very much, Sanjay, for your reflections. Now let's go to question number 2. How did the COVID-19 pandemic affect inequality in the world?
Hugely important question again, and a great one. There's some preliminary evidence, as you will know, that actually the very rich have done well in some countries. The FT reported a couple of weeks ago that the billionaires in the world have actually increased their wealth during the COVID-19 pandemic, although the extent to which that's the case seems to have varied from country to country, because there are some countries, for example, where real estate values, which are important in relation to extreme wealth, have gone down. But by and large, it does seem that the super rich have benefited during this pandemic, in part because stock markets, certainly in the United States, not everywhere, have boomed. But there's also been a repression, of course, of wages and of living standards and growing insecurity for very large numbers of people, not just at the bottom, but also for the middle classes in a number of countries. And the actual extent of the distress which will be experienced may have, unfortunately, yet to be determined, because of the fact that there are emergency programs in place right now, for instance, that are supporting people's wages in many countries. But we have yet to see to what extent the disruption of small businesses or other factors is actually going to ramify over the next months and years, causing permanent losses in output and in income, which are distributionally concentrated at the lower end or in the middle classes. But we don't know the answer. And so I think this is an excellent example of how one could do relevant action-oriented research. There are special challenges to doing something that's focused, a research project that's focused on such a contemporary question, because the data may not be there. One may have to collect the data. One may have to use creative means to try to infer what is the case from the available data. And all of that may be much more difficult than looking at a question where the data has come in some sense, as much as it's ever going to come in particular historical questions, even those which are in the recent past, have that feature very often. So this is a great question which is going to have enormous interest in the world for good reason, but will be challenging.
Indeed. Thank you very much for your reflections. So now let's go to question number 3. And question number 3 says, how can we decouple power from wealth?
Another fantastic question. Obviously, the United States, where I'm sitting right now in New York City, is an example of a country where power and wealth have been quite closely connected, in part because of the role of money in politics. But it's not the only country where that's the case. There are many countries where that's the case, and to some extent where it has become increasingly the case. So to give an example from another country which I am associated with, India, there have been reforms in the legal regime regarding financing of political parties in India, which have made it easier to donate very large funds to political parties and candidates which have no legal source, in the form of so-called electoral bonds, which can be anonymously donated. So there are, I think, developments which have happened in a number of countries around the world, which have, if anything, cemented the connection between money and politics. And therefore, one of the questions which one could ask is, to the extent this is, so to speak, endogenous, there are reasons that the wealthy seek and receive political influence What are the other contrary factors that are always in contention with that? And what determines what is the political equilibrium, so to speak, which actually results? And to the extent that there's a constitutional order, which is either enabling that or standing as a bulwark against that, what is it that causes a certain constitutional order to come into being or to prevail over time? In the case of the United States, for example, going back to that case, you have the US Supreme Court making judgments which essentially sanctify the role of money in politics and make it rather difficult to overturn that. But there are still possibilities there. And I think the recent election victory of Joe Biden in the United States, where the Democratic Party actually had the financial advantage over the Republican Party, interestingly, is an example of how it is that money combined with widespread interest in supporting a certain political cause can sometimes work in a different direction from that which one expects it to. But these are all simply ways of underlining that this is a really great question, but a complex question, and hugely policy relevant in many countries around the world. So I hope that it will be pursued.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it's a fascinating topic and a fascinating question. Very challenging, though. So now let's move on to question number 4. Can new systems of taxation alleviate inequality?
Very important theme. Again, in recent years, of course, there's been a lot of interest in wealth taxes, which I mentioned. Piketty and colleagues have been among those who have emphasized wealth taxes as a solution, even though countries are sometimes going in the opposite direction. India, again, is an example of a country that has actually abolished the wealth taxes that it had rather than extend them. So one has certainly a growing interest in that. But my own view, and I think this also makes for a very important research problem to be studied in this light, is that the role of what is sometimes called pre-distribution, the pre-market and the in-market elements that determine the distribution, and not just what is called redistribution. In other words, taking the market outcomes and correcting them through taxation and transfer. These are also very important, the pre-market and in-market elements. What's an example of a pre-market element? Well, the quality of education would be one example, though only one. Whether individuals have access to high-quality education, which can enable them to be market participants, is a very important consideration, effective market participants, and to contest for remunerative positions. That's a very important consideration in inequality. What is an in-market example? Bargaining within the firm depends very much on collective organization, on the existence of trade unions or other forms of worker representation, and the norms which govern the voice of workers in the enterprise. The German system of co-determination, for example, which allows workers a seat on boards in one way or another, is an example of such a structural guarantee of a level of voice. And this too makes a difference, presumably, in terms of final distribution. So I would say we need to broaden our perspective from post-market tax and transfer instruments to the whole range of policy instruments which make a difference in the pre and the in-market scenarios. But always to keep in mind that the post is always a pre, because this is not a one-shot game. You have a repetition which takes place. And so, of course, there's a causal interaction between all of these. So great topic.
Thank you very much for your insights. I would like to go now to question number 5. How does the rise of the digital economy, with its polarizing, concentrating, or displacing tendencies, challenge the study of the cause and remedy of inequality?
Again, very, very important for understanding inequality today. I gave an example earlier of a company, Facebook, which has generated an enormous amount of wealth, but probably through free content creation on the part of its users. If they weren't providing that content freely, then it's much less likely that it would be profitable on a priori theoretical grounds. So I think one would have to understand that in terms of economic theory differently from a case such as, for example, Amazon or eBay, where there's also enormous concentration of wealth which has taken place, but for somewhat different reasons. If we think about the role of Amazon, for example, as a marketplace which matches buyers and sellers, not always selling goods itself, but simply offering a kind of a matching technology, that role, it seems to me, is one which could very easily be displaced by another entity that has more of a public utility conception behind it. And this is part of the, of course, rationale for regulating Amazon and other such entities, viewing them as being something closer to a public square or a public utility, which ought to have, therefore, a greater element of publicness in terms of how it operates and in terms of how the fruits or rewards from its operation are also distributed. So we would have to, I think about each of these cases differently, but the fact that they have all, in different ways, fundamentally reconfigured the economy, I think is extremely important. And to go back to a theme in my opening remarks, I think the role of increasing returns to scale in these different domains is ubiquitous. It's present in many, many different cases. And that has a lot to do with the role of technology, which was just mentioned, that the kinds of technologies involved require a lot of investment, but once they're in place, once a successful model has been achieved, then there are increasing returns to scale which are attained. And that's a large part, along with the uncompensated labor and other elements, which contributes to the explanation of the giant surpluses which are concentrated in particular hands. But these are just hypotheses. I think it's a great research problem which needs attention, and it's not a sideline. It's something which is at the core, has to be at the core of our understanding of the contemporary world economy increasingly.
Thank you very much. This is a fascinating topic. I would like to ask you one more question or a clarification question. Link and something and also with something that you mentioned before in the presentation. Taxing these digital companies is becoming more and more important, and it seems to have an important role for income redistribution and towards tackling inequality. Now, I would like to know a little bit about your thoughts about the challenges of taxing these digital companies that are widespread all around the world, and particularly if you can also have important questions that would guide research towards this.
So that's another great question, Florencia. You may be aware, and I'm sure many of the participants are aware also, about the moves that have been made in the G20 and in the OECD to create a new international understanding of what the norms should be for taxation of technology companies in particular. Well, taxation of cross-border companies generally, which would include technology companies. It would also include, for example, luxury goods manufacturers, which is why there's something of a tussle, or there was, between France and the United States about this question, because they both have stakes in it, though those stakes are a little bit different in the case of the two countries. I think that this is a hugely important development, which shows that in some sense, a global taxation regime of a kind is very, very slowly emerging. Now, of course, the taxes in question are not going to be actually directly captured by any type of supranational entity. But there is a new understanding which is being brokered among countries as to what the norms will be, which will allow, to be specific, European countries where the citizens use American technology products such as Facebook and Google, for example, or whatever else, to tax those companies for the share of their revenue which is derived from those users in Europe, which European countries had not previously been able to do. And of course, correspondingly, the United States may be able to tax French companies or Italian companies that sell luxury goods for the revenues which they realize in the United States. So there are new elements of a global taxation regime which are embryonically arising here. It's still very initial, but there's a shift in norms and there's a new understanding that's coming about. And that may be only one example of the kinds of things that could be done and that are being done already, are beginning to be discussed already. Now, I think we have to think much more systematically about this problem. There's also been movement on offshore banking arrangements, for example, on trying to close the tax loopholes and the other loopholes which allow offshore banking centers to receive sources of wealth which then escape taxation. I think that a more systematic approach would ask, how can we reap efficiencies as well as generate equity from looking at all of these different aspects together? And by and large, public finance, as I understand it, has not been asking that question. It's been focused very much on a national plane in terms of these kinds of deliberations as to where and how tax revenues can be raised and how it can be used. And we have to change the question a little bit, I think, to be realistic about the contemporary world.
Great. Many thanks for your reflections, and your valuable inputs. This has been great for us. It's very important to count with your reflections in order to develop further and relevant research questions. So once again, and on behalf of the WiseEye community, I would like to thank you for your presentation and for your thoughts, for sharing your thoughts with us. Having said this, now I hand over the floor to the studio again to keep on working about the questions, editing and rephrasing, and keep on reflecting on them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florencia, and keep up the good work, everyone.
Thank you, Florencia, and thank you, Sanjay, for such valuable input into such a relevant topic, especially now. To everyone watching and participating, the session's not over. Remember that right now we switch over to refining the questions and determining together which ones we're going to be adding to the inequalities constellation. So don't go anywhere. Let's go back to our questions moderator.
Thank you so much, Heska, and thank you so much, Florencia and Professor Sanjay, for a fascinating discussion. We received a lot of interesting questions and we covered a lot of questions. However, even good questions can be improved by being more precisely, adequately, or inspiringly formulated. And that is our task for this part of the session. The point is to work collaboratively on alternative phrasings to improve them as research questions before they join the other guiding stars in the inequalities constellation. Everyone is now encouraged to submit new phrasings. We'll go one by one and we'll work together each question one at a time. We're now open for discussion. You may raise your hand and be unmuted to give your input. You can raise your hand by clicking on the participants in the Zoom call window. I encourage you to take the floor and let's talk about these questions. The first question that we have that Sanjay covered is, how does the inequality between capital and labor explain the huge distributional inequalities between the 1% and the 99%? So a few of the things that he had kind of mentioned when we talked about were policy options, what kind of alternatives we have. Has this been historically, has it been consistent historically? If anybody has any thoughts, feel free to raise your hand and jump in and well, while we think about, well, let's stay on this question. So we have a new rephrasing. Is the distributional inequality different in the 21st century? Now, the first question has most of your hearts, but you can actually take your heart and move it to a new rephrasing if you wanted to, if you like that phrasing better. Jack, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yes, Audra, thank you. To me, it's a broad question that I mean, it's an excellent question, which is explains one of the main phenomena in the world today. But it's a broad question that I think we can dig in a little bit to see the feasibility and design of actual proposals is one route to go. For example, the rise of working class shareholding or things like that. But yeah, these are some preliminary thoughts on my end.
That's great, yeah. And I also see that we have Professor Reddy here too, so feel free to jump in and unmute yourself in the discussion. We are in the rephrasing of the question session. And right now we are talking about how does the inequality between capital and labor explain the large distributional inequalities between the 1% and the 99%? And that appears to, oh, okay, we have another one. Is the conflict between capital and labor the main driver of wealth inequality? Well, that one is picking up steam. And so the rephrasing with the most hearts will then make it and replace the top question, which is, could happen here in about 1 heart. But we can also move on to the next question while we kind of think about our favorite phrasings for that one. The next question that was commented on was, how did the COVID-19 pandemic affect inequality in the world? So our notes from Professor Reddy are just cautious that the data may not be available and that wage suppression has happened for a long time and that emergency programs are supporting those. So I wonder if we couldn't be more specific about how do we be more specific?
Hey, Audra.
Hey.
I'm just jumping in because I'm no longer in front of the camera, so I thought, why not?
Well,
I actually wonder about this question. If the question gets at inequalities between countries, or between regions within countries, or between individuals within cities, because right in New York, I've certainly seen the inequality go up. I can imagine that there's also a difference at the urban regional level. And of course, different countries have suffered in greater amounts than others. So I wonder if there's a rephrasing that can kind of attend to that nuance a little bit.
yeah,
But maybe others have thoughts on that before I try to type.
Well, I agree, and it looks like we have another one that kind of changes it from a global perspective. Oh, well, actually, we have a new one. Why did the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbate inequalities within countries? So I kind of like that it kind of focuses a little bit more inequality was existing and how has the pandemic made it worse. And
yeah, absolutely. And exacerbation is perhaps more accurate. I see that one is actually getting likes as we speak. So maybe people agree.
Yeah.
And just a note for anybody else, if you'd like to comment on what your thoughts are, the easiest thing is to raise your hands probably, rather than to just blurt out. But blurting out is also fine.
Yes, I agree. Well, while we chew on that question, we can move to the next question. How can we decouple power from wealth? Earlier on in the session, we had another question very similar to that kind of focused more on the institutional aspect of it. So I don't know if that might be a possible rephrasing. But yeah, I would personally love to know how to decouple power from wealth. And then maybe what that would have on our political process.
I think there's a comment in the chat on this question, or a new question being suggested, perhaps.
Great. Well, Amit Roy, would you like to speak, or I can read this out too? Well, Amit Roy submitted a question. Oh, perfect.
Sorry, yeah. My question is like that. Like suppose we have a factory and is owned by a private person, and in the factory there are 10 machines and there are 10 laborers, and they produce single good in the day, and which valued $10. So if there are 10 machines and 10 laborers, and we suppose that every from a one-to-one combinations, there are just $10 produced. So if we multiply by 10, it will be hundreds. Now, if we distribute the income between the capital and labor equally. Say from each output, labor get $5 and capitalist get $5. So in that case, what happened that are 10 different labors who actually each get 5, but there are only one capitalist who get 5 from each 10 products. So ultimately he will get 50 and 10 laborers will get $5 each. So in that case, even we impose huge taxation, say 50%, still we can just extract $25 from the capitalist and he will have $25 in his hand. And in that case, I don't think what is called the taxation system can eliminate inequality if the capitals stay in the hands of the private owner. But only we can just propose social ownership or just state ownerships. In that case, I think the inequality can be somehow reduced.
Sorry. 2 seconds. Well, I agree, and your question was added to the rephrasing on the how to decouple power from wealth. I don't know if anybody else has any feedback on that. I think it's a great question. Can we eliminate income inequality in a private ownership economy? All right. Well, if anybody has anything else to add to that, I thought it was a great point, and I'm going to highlight that contribution. We can move on to our next question. While everybody kind of thinks of that, and feel free to submit your rephrasings, and we can come back and talk about them, jump in whenever you want. But the next question we have is, how does the rise of the digital economy, with its polarizing, concentrating, and displacing tendencies, challenge the study of the cause and remedy of inequality? That has quite a bit to unpack there too. Maybe it could even be a couple questions. Well, I think that's actually a great question, you know, following a lot of the discussions today on digital economy and inequality. And then, well, I'll let everybody think about that question. I hope I'm not going too fast. Feel free to stop me. We can go back to any other questions that you want. But also the final question, kind of, you know, you might have, your question fits here too, is can new systems of taxation alleviate inequality? What kind of systems would we put into place? All right, well, we have, I like that. How can new systems? Well, yeah, Professor Sanjay, thank you so much for joining us. You know, we have a new rephrasing for the digital economy question too. Let me go back up there.
Hey, Audra.
Yes.
So I actually wanted to jump in. So I'm the person who added the how can new systems of taxation alleviate inequality, because I just thought, well, it's the first one was very closed-ended. So I think as a research question, I would like to see it be like expanded more so that we can actually really dig into the subject. And I'm sure you guys might have better ideas for how that can be done. So that's why I thought of that. But I would really like to see more or better rephrasings in that area so that we can get some meat on that question.
I agree. And I like that. I like that that really opens up the question.
Yeah. It could also be made more specific or something. But I'd like the team that we are, the participants, to come up with more ideas. So I look forward to see how this unfolds.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And How is taking the lead? Quite a bit too. Yes, I definitely like that question better, much more open. Does anybody else have any thoughts? I like it. All right, we got more specific. We have a new one. How can we rethink taxation for the 21st century? That's great. That's forward-looking. And let me, Anisha, let me. All right. Oh, Anisha, go ahead.
Oh, hi everybody. Thank you for such an amazing presentation, Sanjay. Sorry, it's like 3 o'clock here, so 3 a.m., so I'm a little slow. But I just logged in and I saw like a couple of questions. Really interesting one, especially the one with like digital economy. You know, at some point people say that, okay, they have been polarizing, concentrating, displacing. But at the other time, they have also been quite integrating, and we get information from across the world at our fingertips. So at some point, it is also, not just concentrating, but it's also diluting powers. People can voice their concerns, and go ahead. They can sort of like raise their concerns. It's not just while it is polarizing. I think we should try to focus our attention towards how these economy or digital economy can be made more conducive for forward-looking, rather than how can we make digital economy more better for handling the inequality, rather than looking at the adverse effect. Of course, we are aware, but the question should be, how do we go and make it better to overcome inequality? We could look at better rephrasings, and I call upon people to sort of like look into that aspect. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's great. Exactly. Because there are a lot of positive things that have come out of the digital economy. So I like that. That's great. And it looks like I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that one. I think that's, maybe we can work on some positive rephrasings, or, not, something that can tell you that there's good and bad and show it in a positive light. But we also have a few more rephrasings if we want to move. I'm sorry to jump around, guys, but it looks like we have a couple more rephrasings on the how we can couple depower from wealth. If anybody wants to talk, it looks like, how do we understand the relationship between power and wealth? And might it be the key to alleviating inequality? So that's a much more directed and specific question. And it looks like it's about to take the lead as well. I think it's much more specific. And does anybody have any thoughts on understanding the relationship between power and wealth? And Jack, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, to me, it's a great question. Whoever asked it, I personally was sort of thinking, as Tom Ferguson and others have been hinting at, how do we tackle power here? Is one route I'm been thinking about rephrasing. Was it bargaining? Was it kind of getting on the political process? Yeah, still trying to wrap my head a little bit around unpacking this question.
Fair enough. It's a big question.
I'm sure there might be thoughts from people in this chat as well.
Well, I don't know if anybody has any questions about that, but it does look like we have some more rephrasings for our question on the pandemic. So how did the COVID-19 pandemic affect inequality at local, regional, national, and global level? So that kind of packs a lot of questions into one. Oh, sorry, that is, let me highlight that. Bring it up. Looks like we have a duplicate I'll take care of. Yeah, well, a little reflection, I guess, on the inequality is, you know, in around New York, you can just walk in different parts of Brooklyn and you see completely different, like some areas seem untouched and others are boarded up, and others have small businesses are closing through the whole street. And I feel like every time I walk, I see more, but then you go into other neighborhoods and they seem fine, so. Oh, Anisha, I love that. We'll go ahead and add that to the digital. Where am I? Okay, so Anisha just submitted a rephrasing for our digital question. Let me get down there. Sorry about that, and highlight this, which I think is really nice. How can we overcome the polarizing and concentrating tendency? I'm so sorry. Where am I reading this? Yeah, how can we overcome the polarizing and concentrating tendencies of digital economy to address and alleviate inequality? Well, that quickly became everybody's favorite. And it looks like that is now the new question. All right. Well, we have a lot of great votes. It looks like our most popular question, as far as hearts, is the conflict between capital and labor the main driver of wealth inequality? And then our second question is, why did the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbate inequality within countries? And how do we understand the relationship between power and wealth, and how might it be the key to alleviating inequality? And then Anisha's great question is, how can we overcome the polarizing and concentrating tendencies of the digital economy to address and alleviate inequality? And finally, how can we rethink taxation for the 21st century? Would you like to unmute yourself and Miss Abel? I don't want to say your name wrong.
Sure. Yeah. Hi. There is many problems that are going on currently with the COVID-19, and many economists have agreed with me that it was unforeseen, that nobody has seen before. So it's a modern case of Keynesian uncertainty. Well, another case of Keynesian uncertainty in our lifetime was 2008 through 2009, a market crash. But these are the two prominent cases of Keynesian uncertainty, which had never happened before, and therefore we cannot use regular statistical techniques to provide a numerical characterization of it. However, I can provide one by using something called causal modeling. It's not an easy method to actually even implement, and also we have to focus on the data that are reliable and available. So these are the things that I'm doing, but it is coming along very well. So let us see if anybody is interested. Please, you can send me email at suchitra@berkeley.edu. That's my alumni association email, and my other email is sml@scu.edu. Either one will do. So please contact me. Okay, I have spoken and given a poster at the YSI meeting in USC, held in USC last year on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think with that, we are going to wrap up the new rephrasings. And you'll now notice that there is a star next to the questions. And the star is going to be different than the hearts. The hearts are internally, and the stars are for the 100 questions. And over the course of the plenary, you are going to get to pick 10 stars from your favorite questions from the whole galaxy and constellations. And thank you so much for attending the session. We'll go over to Thomas for today.
Thomas and Heske, actually. Hi.
Hello, welcome
back. That was a great session. It was actually a great day. Wow. So can you bring up the graph? There we go. We're in the way. Now, these are just the questions from the latest session here with Sanjay Reddy. Thank you, Audra. Thank you, Sanjay. You see all the blue questions are the questions submitted by the speakers. The white questions are the questions that we just agreed on. And now you can see in the graph that some of these big yellow dots are getting bigger and bigger as they're getting likes and they're spreading throughout the constellations. So yeah, this is the time, as you did in the end of the session, you were able to place likes on the questions if you particularly liked them. But you don't have to do that during the session. You can come back in the middle of the night or tomorrow and place your stars, which are your favorite questions. They'll be displayed on your YSI profile, and they will help determine the list of 100 questions. And I think today was a really great day. We have a lot of good potential questions.
Absolutely, yeah. We covered a lot of ground with many, many different constellations that we had input in for today. I think we started with digital economy with Michael Spence. We covered economic visions with Yanis Varoufakis. We traveled to the innovation constellation with Mariana Mazzucato, and later also with Bill Lazanik. And what else am I forgetting, Thomas? Inequalities, of course, with Sanjay Reddy just now. And Julie Nelson spoke to us about the role of economists and how we understand ourselves and our responsibilities as economists today. So we really traveled the entire galaxy, as you can see behind us. And a lot of questions have been submitted. So thank you all for participating. We are really seeing the stars bubble and travel around us.
Yeah. So now we're going to break it for today. If you're in Asia, then it's going to be tomorrow night before you can watch anything again. But it's already so late now. If you're in the United States or anywhere in the Americas, actually, it's going to be up in the afternoon before. It will close in the afternoon, so you can start watching as soon as you wake up. Thanks for a great day. I think we're really getting into this now. And see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
There's no denying it. The world is in crisis. Unless you're pure transcendent mind or a nihilist, you might not be fine with it. You might be sick. The climate shifts, titans and tyrants vie for the tightest grip. The crises are diverse. But one might inquire if all of these agonized varieties of strife and rift are underlined by what their one bottom line is. Avarice, affluence, influence, finance. It's a common refrain. Blame the economists. But what job is named by that name? Is it obvious? Is the job that has the broadest effect upon the populace? It would probably be best to define what its province is. Ecos means house. Nomos means rules. It's the rules of the house. But whose house is whose? Why do people lose their houses like you see on the news? People may not be economists, but not all are fools. So what are its tools, and what are its concepts, and what are their underlying ideological contents when we talk about growth, gross domestic product? Just because we've got growth, does growth mean progress? Does it often benefit these and not those? As it speaks the open secrets ideologies impose, do we need to rearrange how economics goes? Rearranged economics spells comic nose. Economic questions, it's an economic question. What the heck is going on? It's an economic question. How's it all connected? How's it gonna get corrected in the present and beyond? It's an economic question. What's the GDP per capita? The total output that's in a society divided by the people that it hasn't. At the peak in economics speak, that's like a country's stamina. The data that when gathered demonstrate its people have the stuff they need. But do they need it? What's that mean? We need to eat. But do we really need a piece of every piece of green in Eden? Are the goods we manufacture really good because they sell? Does economic well-being really mean being well? Could theories be objective when theorists depend on the patronage of people who are able to spend? Does it work for the layman or for them who can lend? Can we make ends meet while we meet common ends? Economic questions, it's an economic question. What is going on? It's an economic question. How's it all connected? How's it gonna get corrected in the present and beyond? It's an economic question. I don't have the answers. I'm not a prophet, nor am I a master of the science of profit. Whether that science is misapplied or a proper fit is up to us. It's something that the science could not predict. If you want better answers, you need better questions. The best preventive medicine against the depression. All the young economists with honest intentions. I'll see you at the YSI plenary session.